Now, on December 27th, 2025, Ivory Coast held legislative elections to choose 255 members of parliament. Now, this vote occurred shortly after a controversial presidential election, and the country remains deeply divided. The election saw a high number of independent candidates and a newer third force party attempting to challenge the status quo. As of December 31st, 2025, that is today, the Independent Electoral Commission has confirmed a sweeping victory for President Alassane Ouattara's ruling party, the RHDP, which secured 197 of the 255 seats in the National Assembly. Now, this supermajority marks a significant expansion of the party's power, effectively consolidating its control over the legislative branch just 2 months after Ouattara's controversial re-election. Meanwhile, the main opposition party, that's the PDCI, suffered a major blow, seeing its representation slashed from 65 seats to just 32. The election was defined by deep political apathy and exclusion, with national voter turnout plummeting to just 35.04%. Now, the absence of Laurent Gbagbo's PPACI, which boycotted the poll entirely, left large portions of the electorate without a voice in parliament, while opposition leader Tidjane Thiam has joined calls to invalidate the results due to allegations of fraud and industrial-scale irregularities. But despite isolated reports of violence and destroyed ballot boxes in districts like Makuri, the ruling party now holds a nearly 80% majority, leaving the fragmented opposition with little institutional leverage to challenge the government's agenda. Well, joining us to make sense of this, we have Paul Melly. He is Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House, London, UK. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us at this time.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. All right, Paul, let's get right into it. Now, the RHDP is celebrating 197 seats. It's a massive supermajority, but turnout plummeted to 35%, by the way. Can we really call this a resounding victory for President Ouattara?
It is resounding, but in some ways it's a bit of a hollow victory because Ouattara, he's just been elected for a 4th term. He's very much, this in some ways is a sort of personal political pitch, if you like, a personal political agenda, and in crude numerical terms, a personal triumph, really, to see his RHDP party achieve this big result. But as you pointed out, the PPACI party, founded by Laurent Gbagbo, his predecessor as president and one of the biggest political parties in the country, boycotted the poll altogether, which is a big change from the last parliament, where the group of MPs, group of parliamentarians sympathetic to Gbagbo, had a significant minority presence. And also the fact that the PDCI, probably the largest opposition party, has seen its representation halved, is less, I think, a reflection of the broad balance of opinion among Ivorians, and more a reflection about quite a loss of faith in the process. So it's not a completely hollow victory, but it's certainly a rather emptier victory than the RHDP would like, and it presents the ruling party with a real challenge, because inevitably all governments sometimes have to take very difficult decisions. They have to decide to pursue policies that are not popular. And when the RHDP comes up at one of those moments of challenge, when Ouattara as president comes up against such a moment of challenge, in a curious way, he's not going to have that weight of real, true popular support mandate behind him in taking those really difficult decisions. Because in the presidential race, Gbagbo was not allowed to run because of a former conviction from many years ago. And Tidjane Thiam, the leader of the PDCI, he was disqualified because at one stage he had held French nationality rather than Ivorian, and he didn't recover his Ivorian nationality in time to be registered. So again, the presidential race was also in some ways a sort of a triumph, but an empty one. So it's a difficult situation.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned Tidjane Thiam. I was actually going to ask, because he came in with high expectations and his party has actually been halved, from 65 to just 32 seats. I was going to ask if the Thiam effect failed to materialize, and why couldn't, him as a candidate or as a former candidate or candidate of his stature, bridge the gap through his party. But let's move to Laurent Gbagbo and his party that chose to boycott, and now they have zero voice in the legislature. Because history often shows that boycotts lead to political irrelevance. So would you say that Gbagbo effectively handed Ouattara a 5-year blank check by refusing to play the game?
Well, both of them, both Thiam and Gbagbo, for different reasons, in a way, handed Ouattara a 5-year blank check. But as I say, it's a check that it may be open, but it doesn't necessarily carry the full authority that it would have done if both these parties had been fully participating in both the presidential election and the parliamentary election. And then, if Ouattara had won the presidential and his party had won the parliamentary, he would have a really strong mandate that among Ivorian popular opinion, public opinion, would be viewed as a real backing for his approach. But with a turnout so low, as you pointed out, turnout down to what, 30% or so, and a general sense of disillusion, it's a slightly empty feeling, and that's partly the fault of the, well, you could say partly the consequence of the rules, such as they are, that, the nationality rule that kept Thiam out of the race, the fact that Gbagbo had this old conviction from when he'd tried to seize control of the central bank back when he was president. But in both cases, in the real political world, everybody in Côte d'Ivoire knows that if Ouattara had wanted to get those rules changed to allow them to take part in the presidential race, he could have done. And if he had done that, their parties would have been under whatever their grievances and complaints about the system, they would have found it very difficult to for the PPACI to boycott the race, and the PDCI would probably have done much better in the parliamentary polls. But it's also the responsibility of both of those leaders, because in different ways, they too have failed to reach out. Gbagbo, when he was found innocent by the International Criminal Court and came back to Côte d'Ivoire, to Ivory Coast, there's a feeling among many people that he showed a sort of bitterness towards political rivals and critics that left him, shall we say, somewhat friendless in political terms. And Thiam essentially, with his leadership of his party, he very much said, if I can't be the candidate, then the party is not going to take part in the presidential race at all, even though there was at least one other major party figure who wanted to stand for the party. And so that's discouraged the electorates of both parties. Obviously, the PPACI, their voters weren't even getting a choice, so the substantial southern bloc of opinion in the southwest of the country and in Abidjan, the main city, who support Gbagbo, they were left with nobody to vote for. And the PDCI, who, after all, the roots of that party are in what has, in some ways, many ways, the political and cultural heartland of the country, in the center around Yamoussoukro and in the Cocoa Belt, those voters, they've been given a very mixed message, a party that chose not to bother with the presidential race at all in the end. And then, as a result, you can see that its activists, its campaign machine was very demotivated for the final result. So really nobody's a winner out of this.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the Electoral Commission. They admitted to destroyed ballot boxes in places like Ivory. Yet they say that it did not change the sincerity of the vote. Now, as an analyst, how many broken boxes are required before an election's integrity moves from imperfect to invalid?
Well, it's obviously imperfect, but to say it's completely invalid is probably unfair. But it's certainly lacking in what you might call sort of moral authority. Again, if you have full-throated participation in the system by everyone, even if there are some flaws, even if there are some individual localized cases of abuse or mismanagement, people can feel that overall the system is functioning. And on the other hand, if the political buy-in from the parties and the big politicians, for all those reasons we were just talking about a few minutes ago, isn't there, or is rather hollow, then if there's a sense that some voters think that the voices who represent them are choosing not to take part, and others feel their voices have been excluded, and others who support the government feel that it's all settled in advance because the government will win anyway, then the whole process lacks clout. And then a few electoral abuses, a few broken ballot boxes are kind of neither here nor there. It's pretty clear that in those conditions, the RHDP, the governing party, was going to win comprehensively anyway. And I think it's worth making an interesting contrast with those two preceding big national elections that we had in Ghana just over a year ago, and earlier in 2024 in Senegal. And the results of those were that although in both of those countries there's very partisan politics, strong basis of support for the major parties, essentially everyone feels the process has been gone through. It has taken place. Some people like the verdict, some people don't, but people do accept that the verdict has sort of real validity and authority. And you could say, if you look at the Senegal presidential election, it was clear once the former President Macky Sall had tried to delay the polls and then been ordered by the Constitutional Council to hold them on time after all, it was clear that his supporters were going to suffer, his successor candidate was going to suffer a very punishing result in the presidential, and then they would be punished again later in the parliamentary polls. But all the same, there was a sense of real enthusiasm and buy-in. The turnout was pretty strong. Senegalese people feel they've had their say, and curiously, as Macky Sall's supporters then afterwards reorganized themselves into two groups and tried to rebuild, they're rebuilding from something, because they're rebuilding from a process in which everybody had some buy-in. And I think that's the problem that you can see in particular in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, that, there are, how is it that a country that is the second biggest economy in West Africa and probably the second or third most populous country in the region, and has big pretensions to be a major voice in regional affairs, how is it that when Nigeria can hold a proper election, Ghana can hold a proper election, Senegal can hold a proper election, how is it that the Ivorians find themselves with this sort of partial and imperfect process?
Speaking of, the imperfect process, the opposition has a few days to appeal, but the Constitutional Council is actually rarely seen as an impartial referee. So is there any genuine legal recourse left for the PDCI, or is the court process just a formality before the RHDP solidifies its control?
I think there is a bit of flexibility, but it wouldn't be surprising if one or two people who appear to have lost end up being declared winners. And for example, there's one opposition parliamentarian who's been giving a lot of interviews, a lot of media coverage, because he was defeated and he's very angry about it and very public. You know, it wouldn't be surprised if one or two of those results were reversed at the local level. After all, these are parliamentary constituencies. And given the scale of the government's huge majority, if the opposition end up being awarded a few more seats, that's not going to change the government's power to operate. But in a way, there will still be a suspicion, if that does happen, that those are, how can I put it, politically influenced decisions. That there's a feeling that, okay, so public opinion was a bit upset, so all right, we'll the authorities have allowed another couple of seats through. It's a very, very unsatisfactory process, and I've heard West African commentators say, how is it that a country that has, by general consent, probably the most strongly managed, the most competitive, the most dynamic economy in the entire region, that was able a year or two back to host the AFCON football tournament, incredibly well run with excellent infrastructure, everything flowed smoothly, etc., etc., etc. How is it that a country that could do all those things somehow still seems to have a flawed political process and a flawed political culture?
Okay. Well, Paul would actually be going on a quick break now. When we come back, I will definitely continue this conversation. Please stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on the conversation. We're still discussing Ivory Coast's post-election with Paul Melly. Thank you so much for staying, Paul. Now let's move on to the 197 seats. Ouattara now has the numbers to change the constitution on a whim. You know, would you say this is the biggest threat to Ivorian stability now? That's the lack of an opposition, or the potential for the president to extend his grip on power even further?
I think probably the bigger threat is actually the fact that the opposition, as we've just discussed, isn't fully represented in Parliament, that it's weak, or that one of the main strands of the opposition has no parliamentary presence at all when it used to be in Parliament, and the other main opposition bloc has seen its strength halved. So the sort of effectiveness, the public visual effectiveness of Parliament and the legislature as a place where questions get asked and ministers are held to account, and government is pushed to reflect on different issues and address new challenges and face up to awkward criticism, that's been drastically weakened. I think certainly, yes, Ouattara has the numbers now to make a further constitutional change if he wants. But when he ran for the presidency, he said, my job this time, this is going to be the presidency of preparing for the next generation, basically. Because he was harking back to, in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, he had said he wouldn't run and he would hand over to a new generation. It was time to hand over. Then his own chosen preferred successor candidate died suddenly of a heart attack, and he then stepped back in and ran for one more term. So he was very aware of that criticism. He's already 83 years old. He was very aware of that criticism that he was getting old in a country which has an overwhelmingly youthful population. And he made a specific point in the run-up to this election of saying that this is the election to prepare for the next generation. And his political sales pitch, if you like, when you talk to Ivorian government figures, their constant message is, look, we know that this is a young country. We know that there's massive youth demand for jobs, and we are competent economic managers, and our big priority is delivering employment. That's what we know we've got to do. So I think that Ouattara would prefer to be seen as the president who, although there was a lot of controversy around this election, could turn around in a year or two and say, look at the number of jobs created and look at the sustained economic growth, and possibly, and this maybe is something else on his agenda, you know, the very delicate negotiations between ECOWAS and the AES, the Alliance of Sahelian States, after all, following the walkout of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger from ECOWAS almost a year ago. If a new sort of partnership agreement or regional cooperation framework is agreed between ECOWAS and the Sahelian countries, Ouattara, I'm sure, would want to be very much, you know, perceived as one of the big figures who had been associated with that. I mean, his ministers, his team constantly stress, look, he is a very experienced statesman. He's not just an economic manager. He's also someone who has real authority and influence in regional affairs. And so I think that would be, again, something else. So from his, if there's progress on that, there's progress in employment and possibly progress on currency reform, you know, either reforming the CFA franc or else even moving to the long promised ECO regional currency. I think he would probably prefer to be seen as somebody who had retired having left those legacies. And so the real, in terms of democracy, the real risk, I think the biggest risk is just that Parliament comes to be seen as irrelevant or having no weight, no real weight at all. So other elections for regional councils, for municipal councils, they're also going to be quite important in Côte d'Ivoire because, you know, Abidjan is a big city, what, 6-8 million people. You've got some important regional councils, those sorts of things. It'll be interesting to see how the opposition rethinks. And we're already seeing rumblings of dissent and discussion within the PDCI. It's quite clear that a lot of people in that party disagree with the way that Tidjane Thiam has handled this whole strategy.
So still speaking on the PDCI, I mean, we saw several young ministers win their seats handily. And on allegations of malpractice, the PDCI has explicitly accused the ruling RHDP of buying voter cards for 30,000 CFA francs. So if these figures are accurate, what does it say about the 255-seat National Assembly, you know, that represents the people? What are your thoughts?
I think we remain to have the results of any kind of proper investigation of those allegations. And after all, we know all too often people throw around allegations about corruption and malpractice and mismanagement in elections.
Just before you go ahead, let me also include, you know, that the allegations that the Electoral Commission has failed to explain the disappearance of 25,000 voter cards in Port as well.
Well, I think that's a significant allegation, not so much in total numbers countrywide, but Port is a particularly prominent constituency. It's the area around Abidjan Airport. So it's very well known to many people. It's also well known because it's the area where there used to be a big French military base. Now the French just have a small training detachment now, so that military situation's changed. But it's an how should we put it? It's an election that people will really notice in Ivorian terms, just as, you know, it would be the equivalent in Nigeria of, you know, if you have an election in an important state capital or in one of the big big parts of Lagos, people will notice what happens there. So that allegation and what comes out of it is controversial, especially because it seems that that was a surprise government win. So I think, again, it's very hard to know, obviously, what the results of what the truth of that situation is and other alleged abuses. And that some of the allegations may be more a sense of sort of grievance as well, that the government has just done a lot of public spending in some places that were electorally sensitive. But there may also, we remain to discover whether there actually was serious malpractice. The question one poses is, given that the RHDP were pretty much assured of a big victory anyway, what interest would they have in actually manipulating the results? But I retain an open mind. I wouldn't like to claim one way or the other what the more likely truth about those things was.
All right. So, well, just before we wrap up, let's have your final thoughts on this.
Well, I would say, I think the key point is, you know, there are some countries that have a lot of influence in the region and at a continental level, and Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, is one of those. And this has clearly been an unsatisfactory whole election process right through the presidential and legislative polls, because for democracy to sort of work in its most fulfilling way, you want all of the main strands of opinion and partisan movements and contenders all to be in the race, if you like, so that the voters have a real opportunity to choose. And for a host of different reasons, that hasn't happened this time. And many Ivorians will be unsatisfied, dissatisfied with that result, and feeling that it doesn't really reflect the full balance of opinion, and particularly in this controversial context where Ouattara has run for and won a fourth term with a big majority, something that many Ivorians had felt it was time already for a generation change. So in that broad context, it's particularly important to have both presidential but now parliamentary elections that everybody feels were really worthwhile and represent the strands of opinion. And as I say, I think Senegal is a good comparator, because there the ruling PASTEF party has a crushing majority in parliament, but nobody doubts the credibility of the parliamentary polls. And the same went for the presidential race. And in parliament, all the key opposition strands of opinion are represented, even if they don't stand much chance of actually winning any major votes. So the Senegalese people can feel that all their views are represented. And in Ivory Coast, in Côte d'Ivoire, that's not the case now. And it's not a very, you know, there's a sort of unsatisfied mood or dissatisfied taste, I think. That's fundamentally why it matters. And this is a really important country, so it matters a lot.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Paul Melly, for your expert thoughts and opinion on this. We appreciate you for your time, and a Happy New Year to you.
And a Happy New Year to you as well.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.